Hey there, and welcome to my talk. It's lovely to meet you. Well, sort of. I'm Noam, father, husband, pizza lover, psychologist by training, and currently director of user research at Wealthfront. I'd like to invite you on a brief journey. I originally embarked on this journey because I had doubts about whether I belong in this profession or not. I'll tell you why in a second. Perhaps you've had similar doubts as well. This journey has 3 parts. First, we're going to go all the way back to the beginnings of our field, UX research. Who were some of the founders of the field? How did they get to that position? What were their backgrounds? What were they working on? What were their stories? Then we're going to jump to the present and talk about some of our incredible peers in UX research. We're going to talk about their unique paths to UX research and how those paths shaped their superpowers and therefore their career as well. Finally, we're going to talk about the future of our industry and 3 potential barriers to belonging, which I believe their time is over. So listen, perhaps you feel a bit like an imposter sometimes. Perhaps you've had doubts about whether you've got what it takes to be a UX researcher, whether your background, your knowledge, your skills, your personality, or anything else are a good fit, the necessary fit to become a UX researcher or to thrive as a UX researcher. If that's the case, then I hope by the time we're done, I'll convince you that you're wrong. So let's go on this journey together. So I'm a psychologist by training. To be precise, I have a PhD in social personality psychology from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Shout out to all my fellow Illini. I had an incredible experience there. The only bad thing was that the colors of the university were orange, and my wife almost wanted to kill me for that. But putting that irrelevant detail aside for a second, what matters for this story is that I am not a clinical psychologist, and you'll see why that's important in a second. When I share with people that I'm a psychologist, they never fail to ask me the following question: what's a psychologist doing in tech? Now, people ask this question when this is the image they have of a psychologist. It usually involves things like a couch. It usually involves things like a patient, a notebook, stories about your past relationship with your mother or father, poor handwriting in a notebook. You get the point. Now look, that may be an accurate representation of some psychologists, but there's a lot more to the field of psychology than simply clinical psychology. Psychology is the science of behavior and mind. It's the science of conscious and unconscious. It's the science of feeling and thought. It's an academic discipline of immense scope. Most psychology departments have 8 to 10 subdivisions within them. And if I was trained on all this stuff, if I was trained on understanding people's minds, understanding their needs and their wants, understanding their attitudes, behaviors, cognitions, is it possible that UX research still isn't for me, that I'm not a good fit? Is it possible that UX research isn't the right place for me? I'll tell you what, I was asked this question so often, I genuinely began to doubt whether I belong as a UX researcher. Are people right? Maybe a psychologist isn't meant to be a user researcher. Do I have the right knowledge and skills? Did I gain the right knowledge and skills in graduate school and everything else I did before that? Do I belong in UX research? So I decided to embark on a quest, first and foremost for myself, but today I want to share it with you. I wanted to explore the past, the present, and the future of UX research, and I'll tell you why. So before going on this quest, this journey of belonging, I realized 3 things. Number 1 is that I didn't know much about how our field began. How did UX research begin? Who were some of the first UX researchers? Essentially, it was probably not called that at the time. What were their backgrounds? What were they working on? How did they get to that point? Number two is that I hadn't really reflected on the careers that my peers, my incredible peers took. What led them to become UX researchers? What did they study? What did they do? What contributed to their success in their careers? What was it about their backgrounds that contributed to their success? What were their superpowers and how did they develop them? And number three is that I didn't have a clear perspective on the future of UX research. And I felt I had to develop that if I wanted to build and lead incredible UX research teams. So let's begin this journey with the past. Where did our industry begin? There's some agreement that the first inklings of UX research began about 100 years ago. Around this time, Frederick Winslow Taylor was on his own quest to improve workplace efficiency. He was a mechanical engineer, a pioneer of Taylorism, or also known as the scientific management theory. He was on a mission to make human labor more efficient, so he conducted really deep research into how people interact with their tools. Putting aside some of the flaws and the criticisms of Taylor's work, bottom line, he was studying these relationships between humans and the tools they use. And that is kind of what we do to this day, maybe with different technology, but same principle. But anyway, I'd like to skip ahead a bit to post-World War II and these two particular individuals, Alphonse Chapanis and John E. Carlin. Ever heard of them? Why don't we start here with the fact that hundreds of planes crashed in World War II? Wonder why? I was actually fascinated by this story because I served in the Israeli military in the Air Force, and my job was actually to shoot down airplanes and missiles, pretty much anything in the sky. For context, I served in Israel's missile defense unit a long time ago. So perhaps when you see me share this, you think to yourself, well, maybe hundreds of planes crashed because hundreds of planes were shot down, right? Nope. Those planes crashed because the image on the left is an image of flaps, and the image on the right, well, it's not flaps. It's landing gear. Let me read you the definition of flaps first of all. Flaps, a high-lift device used to reduce the stalling speed of an aircraft wing at a given weight. Now, we don't need a definition for landing gear, right? If you don't deploy landing gear, you crash. Now, at this point you might be thinking to yourself, where is this going, Captain Obvious? I did not buy a ticket to this conference to learn about the history of aviation. But here's the thing, these days, the levers that control flaps and landing gear don't look the same and don't feel the same. But back then, they did. And it turns out that kind of matters, because that's why hundreds of planes crashed in World War II. And we have this guy, Alphonse Chapanis, to thank for solving this problem. Chapanis was notably active in improving aviation safety. Among other things, he worked on something called shape coding. Chapanis found that certain cockpit controls were confused with one another because of either their proximity or their shapes. He proposed attaching a wheel to the end of the landing control lever because landing controls make the wheels come out. Whereas on the flaps lever, he suggested putting a triangle shape. This would make both levers easily distinguishable between each other. And guess what? Once Chapanis instituted these changes, the crash rate because of that particular error, well, the crash rate plummeted to zero. Maybe I shouldn't have used the word plummeted in that context. Even more amazing is that this shape coding that Chapanis essentially invented through the research he conducted, it's still used today, many decades later. In 1949, Chapanis published the first book ever on ergonomics, Human Factors in Engineering Design. To this day, he's considered one of the founders of our profession. Okay, one more story from the past. You ready? Do you know why we say to dial, why we use the verb to dial when it comes to phones? Well, that's because several decades ago, we used a dial phone or a rotary phone. in case you were wondering how to use a dial phone, let me tell you. To dial a rotary phone, first remove the handset from the cradle and listen for the dial tone. Then you put your finger in the number you want to dial and you rotate the dial clockwise until you hit the metal stop. Then of course you just rinse and repeat until you dial the full number. But how did we get from this strange contraption to this? In the decades following World War II, a group of social scientists and engineers in New Jersey were doing research on the phone, and they were led by a man named John Carlin. Just to give you an idea of where phones were before they did that research, let me read you a bit about how the rotary phone worked. Old school rotary dialing operated by interrupting the line circuit, creating pulses as the dial rotated past each number. The local exchange counted the pulses to know what number had been selected or dialed. Now, initially, telephone networks were all isolated. The numbers available to connect to were limited. They were limited only to those you could make on the local exchange. You couldn't just call an international number. To dial anywhere long distance, you had to connect to an operator to do that for you. They would manually connect the call from switch to switch until you reached your international destination. These days, that sounds kind of bonkers. Mind-blowing, I know. But around the time John Carlin and his colleagues were doing their research, it also started to become a possibility to call people long distance directly. Except you couldn't do that with the typical rotary phone. Long distance calling required something called in-band signaling, which only the more modern phones that John Carlin and his team helped invent were capable of doing. And so that made the rotary phone obsolete. Now this is Bell Labs, which is of course named after Alexander Graham Bell, who is credited with inventing the first telephone. Carlin worked at Bell Labs until 1977 when he retired, and to this day, he as well is considered one of the fathers of human factors engineering and what is these days called UX research. One of the amazing things about John Carlin's research is that it affected so much more than just the telephone. His research influenced the design of gas stations, ATMs, vending machines, medical equipment, the list goes on and on. In a piece in the New York Times written about John Carlin, they wrote this: "It is not so much that Mr. Carlin trained mid-century Americans how to use the telephone. It is rather that by studying the psychological capabilities and limitations of ordinary people, he trained the telephone, then a rapidly proliferating but still fairly novel technology, to assume optimal form for use by mid-century Americans." So that's Johnny Carlin. But have you guessed it yet? Have you guessed it? Because guess what? Chapanis and Carlin were both psychologists. So bonus points if you guessed it. And so when these days people ask me, what's a psychologist doing in tech? I make sure to tell them the stories of Chapanis and Carlin in great detail, just like I guess I'm doing right now. Now, to be clear, exploring the journeys of Chapanis, Carlin, and others I haven't shared here, this was part of my personal journey to understand the role of psychology in the realm of UX research. But here's the thing. Chapanis and Carlin worked at Bell Labs with a very diverse set of colleagues, and those colleagues came from pretty much every imaginable background, probably a background which is very similar to yours. The fact is, I've met researchers from countless disciplines, some of which I've never heard of, which I think is a good segue to the present. The present. Successful researchers and what made them that way. On my quest to understanding belonging in our industry, I wanted to reflect on the careers of some of the researchers I admire and figure out how they got to where they are today. What made them so successful? What were their superpowers? Luckily, I didn't have to look far, because at UXRConf, I've met some of the most inspiring, special group of researchers and research leaders ever. And I'm going to share just a few of their stories right now. Now, to be clear, these are my reflections on their work and why I believe certain things in their backgrounds and their histories, it gave them superpowers, and those superpowers are what made them so successful. This is Behzad Sejani. These days, he's the founder of Yet Another Studio, an independent research practice. Behzad helps bring rigor to people's curiosity through his partnership and his training. But to me, Behzad's superpower is his creativity and his eye, which has been developed through years and years of practicing photography. Behzad emphasizes the rigor he brings to his work, and I couldn't agree more. He does. But have you seen the way he communicates an idea? It's absolute magic. For example, in this fairly recent graphic where he compares researchers with athletes, which is basically the only time I have ever been compared to an athlete in my life. This incredible analogy between athletes and researchers and how most of our work is invisible really captured my eye. Again, the way Behzad communicates these ideas is absolutely phenomenal in its elegance and its simplicity. It's the sort of visual representation that could only come from someone with Behzad's talents. Your ability to communicate ideas crisply, I love that word crisply, by the way. It's a critical skill to have as a researcher. And I would suggest that the reason Behzad does this so well again and again is because of years of training as a creative and a photographer and practicing that every single week. So in this case, even if you didn't necessarily imagine that photography is a useful skill to have or a useful background to become a UX researcher, well, Behzad proves you wrong. This is Sam Ladner, principal researcher at Workday. Now, I look up to Sam for many reasons, one of them being she is an accomplished author, which is something I've always wanted to be. She's authored at least 2 books I know of, Practical Ethnography and Mixed Methods. And by the way, I highly recommend you read both books if you haven't yet. But I also look up to Sam because she is one of the rare examples of a true mixed methods researcher, which is for sure a superpower if you have it. Again, it's incredibly rare in my opinion, and we'll come back to that afterwards. Where did she get this superpower? I would suggest her superpower comes from her background and from researching technology from at least 3 different angles, given her background: journalism, communication, and sociology. In the opening to her book, Mixed Methods, Sam perfectly captures the challenges we have as researchers in the modern era. These are challenges we can only overcome with a multifaceted, complex triangulation of approaches in our research. Let me read this bit to you. It's an extraordinary time for the automated collection of quantitative data. Once upon a time, all quant data had to be created manually through surveys or painstaking observations of human behavior. Now, our devices and software create endless reams of what Davis and Davidson dubbed data exhaust, or the data that are automatically generated through digital interactions. This is incredibly exciting for researchers because we now have access into human behavior through a passively collected empirical method. But I often tell people to tamp down their excitement about data exhaust because none of these data are actually designed for falsifiability in mind. It's simply the detritus of our digital lives. Just because we have more data doesn't mean we are doing better research. We are drowning in an endless sea of data, yet we are stuck in an insight desert. Such is the contemporary experience of many researchers. So how do you develop the sort of approach that Sam takes to her research? Well, part of that is in this incredible trifecta of methods, of knowledge that Sam has developed throughout the years given her training. Her work combines deep qualitative investigation with a deep understanding of technology and media. And finally, she also has a deep understanding of the development of the structure and functioning of human society. That is Sam's superpower. This is Claire Menke, a research manager at Facebook. Claire studied Earth systems for her advanced degree. Have you ever heard of Earth systems? When you think of a typical UX researcher career path, have you contemplated whether Earth systems is the right choice to go? I know I haven't, and to be honest, I didn't even know what an Earth system degree means until I checked. Let me read you the description. The Earth Systems program is an interdisciplinary environment science major and co-terminal master's program. Students learn about and independently investigate complex environmental problems caused by human activities in conjunction with the natural changes in the Earth system. They become skilled in those areas of science, economics, and policy needed to tackle the world's most pressing social environmental problems, becoming part of a generation of scientists, professionals, and citizens who approach and solve problems in a systematic, interdisciplinary way. Wow. But here's the thing. I read that, I thought about what Claire does, and it just hit me. You see, I really admire Claire for being able to combine complex research framework into this kind of multifaceted Uber framework that combines different aspects of those various frameworks. I'm getting confused just saying it. But in this example you can see before you, Claire has combined personas with jobs to be done, with customer journeys, so 3 different methods, with 3 different kind of frameworks or levels around them, including the attitudinal side, the situational side, the experiential side. It's bonkers what she's doing here, in case you haven't noticed. Claire thinks at a level of complexity that most people, including myself, never really reach. But it all made sense to me. It hit me again when I saw this. And I realized that years ago, when Claire was in this Earth Systems master's degree, she was studying incredibly complex problems using even more complex frameworks. Exactly the same sort of work that she's been doing recently in her UX research. That's precisely Claire's superpower, and I seriously doubt people appreciate how an advanced degree in something like Earth Systems can contribute to such amazing contributions later on to the field of UX research. This is Mithula Naik. She's currently the interim head of design at the Canadian Digital Service. There's also a French term for this, but I'm not very good at French and I'll spare you. Mithula trained as a designer, and she has tackled an incredible array of problems, including being part of the team that invented the first helmet designed specifically for women in India. She's since worked on a bunch of things, but most recently she works for the Canadian government as a public servant, working on health, immigration, refugee issues, and loads more. But when she started her career, she was a frustrated designer living in India in Bangalore. This was back in 2008, and many of the products and services she was seeing were not meeting the needs of the very diverse population in India. That was because these products and services were not well researched and people did not understand that particular population. Mithula is inspired by the daily realities of people's lives. She strives to develop products that include a deep understanding of all of the ecosystems around people's day-to-day lives. In her own words, this type of work inspired her sensitivity early on to the value of user experience and strategy at the intersection of design research, social innovation, and product design. And so here we have a designer, an immigrant whose unique background led her to emphasize with diverse needs of the populations she serves. And that is an incredible superpower. And talk about incredible. This is Viviane Castillo. Her current role is a senior design researcher at Salesforce. But Viviane defines herself as an inclusive innovator and a humanity in tech advocate warrior. I couldn't agree more, by the way. Prior to becoming a UX researcher, she worked as a counselor and a therapist. In those roles, she tackled issues like empathy, shame, vulnerability, and compassion. And she credits these experiences as a great influence on her approach to research, innovation, technology, and everything she does. I'll tell you this, I don't think anyone has influenced my thinking on our profession and our responsibilities as UX researchers more than Viviane. She's transformed my understanding of empathy, of self-neglect, of what allyship is or should be. She's illuminated things in my experience that I never even realized were there. And guess what? That's exactly what a great counselor and therapist would do. In one of my favorite tweets from Viviane, she wrote, "We hold on to buzzwords like empathy so tightly because they're almost a part of our identity as UX researchers, yet I don't see or hear a lot of conversations in UX about psychology, counseling, or therapeutic relationships." Viviane's background is necessary in our profession. Necessary. Her voice is absolutely crucial if we're going to be protecting, elevating, and advocating for the people we serve every day. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? People never understand what a psychologist would be doing in tech. Why would a psychologist not be in a clinic? Yet a former human counselor and therapist is teaching us all how to be better researchers and how to be better people. Again, an incredible superpower because of Viviane's unique background. And so we arrive at the future and what I think it won't be, what it may be, and why you belong. We started by looking into the past, and thankfully we discovered that psychologists have made important contributions to the field of UX research. Phew! And we've observed how a handful of present-day researchers have been so successful, so inspiring because of their surprising and unique backgrounds. Those backgrounds, the things they studied, the things they did, they led to their superpowers and their success in our industry. But what's ahead and what's waiting for you and for me in our industry? I've come to realize that it's my responsibility, or I need to take responsibility for developing a perspective on this, on the future of our field. I want to help improve it. I want to build incredible teams. I want everyone to belong because you do. But there are at least 3 barriers to belonging, and I want to talk about them now because I don't think they are in the future of our profession, and they are generalism, individualism, and method and toolism. Generalism is also known as the full stack researcher, the quant and qual researcher, the design and researcher. I share Wanda's perspective that you can't know everything and you need to develop a deep expertise. The idea of the generalist researcher is mistaken, and it creates a feeling of not belonging amongst many UX researchers. Because if I'm expected to be a generalist, if I'm expected to do it all, I mean, that can raise so much anxiety, so many worries. How do I accomplish all of this? How can you be a full stack researcher? How can you be a quant and a qual researcher? How can you be a designer and also a researcher? And you know what? You can't. You simply cannot. A mixed methods researcher is simply a researcher who is mediocre at everything. The dumbest people I know are those who know it all. Malcolm S. Forbes. Do not do this to yourself. Do not hold yourself to an impossible bar. You're never going to reach it. The future will not belong to generalists because there are very few true generalists. And by the way, fun fact, in all of my roles so far in UX research, I was defined as a generalist. I was hired as a generalist. And again, I think that is a mistake because I think that does not exist. So that's about generalism. Let's move on. The second thing I don't think the future will include is individualism, the notion of the sole researcher, the team of one, the independent. That idea of individualism also erodes feelings of belonging in this industry. Why? Because it's a lonely path to take. And it's also impossible to conduct great research this way. Now, I have to say, because you might be thinking this, I get it. In countless companies, we do have, de facto, research teams of one, right? It happens. Well, I actually think that's wrong, because if you're doing research the way I think research should and could be done, then you're never actually alone. Napoleon Hill said, "It is literally true that you can succeed best and quickest by helping others to succeed." You are never alone if you're empowering and coaching others to do better research. People are incredibly complex, multifaceted creatures. You cannot figure out people on your own. And again, it can get lonely by yourself, which I know a lot about because I've been sitting in a room in front of a camera by myself for a pretty long time at this point. If you help others belong in research, you will feel more belonging too. And finally, method and toolism, learning constantly focused on the next tool or method. I get this question all the time from aspiring researchers. Which tool should I use? Which skill should I develop? What's the most important right now? What method should I brush up on? Later on, people become almost obsessed with adding more and more tools to their inventory, more and more methods, keeping up with the latest thing. And I'm guessing you probably know what I'm going to say by now. This faulty approach always leaves you feeling behind, feeling like you don't belong because you're always underprepared and undereducated, at least in your own mind. Maybe you feel like you're drowning in information just to learn another tool that you're currently obsessed with but don't really need. Don't get me wrong. Research methods are important. Tools are valuable. And I hope we as a community continue to develop our practice, our methods, our tools, all of the ways in which we conduct research. But I believe this will be an area of focus for certain people within our community, not an obsession for all of us. So what is in our future? I believe what is in our future is diversity of thought and experiences, democratization and empowerment, and a shared learning of people. When I think of generalism versus diversity, I think that generalism is basically the idea of doing it all, having broad skills, knowing everything there is to know about research from all different perspectives. Whereas with diversity of thought, we have gradual specialization, which takes time and is really crucial to become an incredible leader. We have team perspectives and we leverage deep group expertise because, again, to understand the complex nature of the people we serve, we need that group expertise. No one person will have enough to figure that out. The incorrect notion of individualism, it puts you in this lone wolf situation, separatism. It doesn't work and it's not good for anyone. And remember, even if you're a team of one, that does not mean you're alone. In a model that's based on democratization, you can empower others, you can coach others to do research. It's an approach focused on coaching and mentoring and learning through teaching because you know what? One of the best ways to grow and become a better researcher is to teach someone else how to do something. And then, I don't think you should be obsessed with anything, whether it's a method or your customers, as fashionable as being customer obsessed or user obsessed is these days. Rather than obsessing over learning the latest tool or the latest method, obsess over learning the latest insight together As a team, I want you to look into that mirror. What do you see? Look carefully. You are a researcher. You might think you don't fit the pattern. There is no pattern. You might think that you can't get going yet. You need to attend another conference, learn another method, read another book. You don't. You are uniquely positioned to contribute. For the rest of this conference, I'm asking you to go on your own journey. Discover all of the superpowers, the research superpowers that you have within you. Then I want you to talk about it. I want you to write about it. The organizers of this incredible conference, they want to hear from you. I want you to develop those ideas and share them with the world. Those who know me know that I'm inspired by my children and children in general. When it comes to the feeling of imposter syndrome, a feeling that you don't belong, I'm reminded of this quote. The moment you doubt whether you can fly, you cease to be able to do it. Sir James Matthew Barrie from Peter Pan. In case you had any doubts, I am here to remind you, have no doubts. You are a researcher and you belong. I want to thank everyone at the UXR Collective who organized this incredible conference. A special thanks to Alec and Maggie. You make me believe in magic. It was a great honor and privilege to be with you here today. If you ever feel like you don't belong in this industry, if you're looking for a bit of mentorship or guidance or piece of advice, I am here for you. These are my details. I'd love for you to get in touch. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Cheers.